All right, let's jump into it. So welcome in everybody to our webinar on this year's new digital PSAT. We are very excited about this change to the PSAT. The writing's kind of been on the wall in terms of the standardized tests for college admissions going to a computer-based format for a long time. And so this was the year that we finally, got to focus on transitioning our students over to this new format of tests. So it's been top of mind for us for a long time now, getting ready to prepare students for both this PSAT where appropriate and then the SATs that will come. My name's Jim Wismer. I'm the director of IB Experience. My co-host is Tori Burke, our assistant director. And so if you call the IB Experience office number, you typically have the pleasure of being greeted by one of the two of us. And we together oversee all of the tutoring at IB Experience. And that goes for both standardized tests and academic subjects. One quick opening note before we jump into the substance of the presentation. Please use the Q&A feature and the chat to drop any questions that you have as we go through the presentation. We'll keep open for a Q&A portion at the end of the presentation today. So we're not going to address questions as we go unless we see something come in and it's something we totally missed and forgot to talk about. But for the most part, we'll address your questions at the end. So just go ahead and drop them in the chat or the Q&A, and then we'll run through all of those as we get there. So with that said, let's talk about the timeline for this new test. So I want to talk first about the international timeline for digital SAT implementation. Last year's PSAT was digital internationally, and all SATs internationally have been digital since March of this year. So the reason I say that is because one of the things I hear commonly from parents and students is that, oh, it's such a shame that the juniors this year are guinea pigs for this new test. And that's really not the case. The international students were the guinea pigs, and that's already happened. College Board has had reps, rolling this out smoothly overseas. We have some colleagues in the industry who mostly work with overseas students, and they have assured us that it's gone very well overseas. This new digital version of the test has been smooth. The implementation of the digital version of the SAT in the US is going to be on a larger scale than internationally. So that will bring different problems and challenges. At the same time, it did go well the first time, so we don't anticipate kind of major and widespread problems on this new digital test. I first want to assure everyone of that because I've heard plenty of concern from parents about, being the test subjects for something new. The other thing I want to mention is that we do have a mixed group in here. I mentioned juniors earlier, and so our crowd's mostly going to be juniors today. And I'm aware of that. I see plenty of junior parents in the chat who I've talked to many times at this point. But we also have sophomore and freshman families in the chat. So I'm going to be, referencing things that are relevant to juniors and some things that are relevant for the younger students. So juniors are in this transition year where the SATs now until December are in the paper version, and then the digital version of the test really picks up in March, other than this PSAT, which will be digital, of course, this month. But for sophomores and all younger classes, every SAT they would ever take will be in the digital format. So let's keep that in mind as I'm kind of going through what we need to talk about tonight. All right, so the most important thing to address up front is why the PSAT is important and why it isn't important. The most important thing that the PSAT is a practice test for the SAT. It gives students a benchmark score for what they could expect to score on an SAT. And it also gives students experience with this new digital standardized testing format that they might not be used to, or they might be used to. There are some states like New Jersey who have been doing state testing digitally already, but other states do their kind of statewide standardized testing on paper. So for some students, it's new, for others, it isn't. It just kind of depends on what you've seen before, but this will be a great experience in this format of testing. It also gives schools a chance to test drive the new format. And what I mean by that is that, schools in the US are operating this new testing format for the first time. They have to make sure they have, enough cable extenders to plug in everyone's laptop. They have to make sure that every student has their account set up and all of that. So it gives the PSAT, because it's a lower stakes test, colleges won't see your PSAT scores. It gives schools a chance to kind of get that experience before they're running the real SAT. And then it's also used to qualify for the National Merit Scholarship, but only in 11th grade. So let me be clear that for about 96 to 99% of 11th graders, and for all sophomores and younger, the PSAT is purely a practice test. So it just gives you a chance to try an SAT-like test. But for those students who can score in the top 1% for national merit, that allows them to, have an extra honor. And we'll talk about national merit a little later on. But the National Merit Award is really the only thing that the PSAT has a lasting impact on. Colleges aren't going to see the score. It doesn't stick to you in any way other than that. So that's something to bear in mind here.
Mm-hmm. So you might be wondering, what's different about this new test? And the most obvious difference that Jim has already alluded to is that, well, it's on a computer. And therefore, we have a couple of different ways that we can take it, and none of those ways are paper. So the 3 recommended ways to take it are on a school-issued Chromebook. A regular Chromebook will not work. So if you've got a Chromebook that's personal, you cannot use that, but a school-issued Chromebook should work. A personal laptop will work, and then most tablets will work as well. It's important to make sure that your device is cleared by the College Board, and they've got a really extensive list of what is cleared and what isn't cleared. Eventually, also, it will be an option to take the test on a phone, but we would not recommend that for obvious reasons. This is what the test will actually start to look like. The true nerds among us, possibly just Jim and I, but maybe others, will notice that this is much the same as the test already looked. In fact, it's even the same font. So that's very comforting for me, someone who has been staring at this test for many years. I'm like, well, they've got their font on lock, everything's fine. For others, that might not matter to you. Probably it won't. But it does make me feel good. You can see that here that you just click on the actual answer and move forward. The other major difference in terms of technology is the introduction of the Desmos graphing calculator. So the Desmos calculator is something that most students will have already been exposed to. And it's a really, really powerful tool, so that's awesome. Although some people like me, you might have a true love affair with your TI-84 or TI-89 and you want to bring that instead, and that's still totally allowed. So what Desmos actually looks like in the real test is that you can really use it much more intuitively and with a lot less training than we've been using TI-84s. So for example, here we've got this question that's a linear equations question. You can just type the equation right into Desmos over here. So you're just typing in this y equals mx plus b format. You'll just type y equals negative 6x minus 32. And in this case, we're looking for our y-intercept. And you can actually just click directly onto the graph. Okay, where does it cross the axis? Crosses the axis right here. There's the y-intercept. So the eagle-eyed among you may notice that because this is y equals mx plus b, you can just also know that your b value is your y-intercept. But this is also really useful for more advanced questions as well, such as systems of equations questions. On the SAT version of this program, you can actually type as many as 4 equations in at once, which is really helpful for graph matching questions as well as systems of equations questions. So it's actually a really powerful tool that we're really excited that everybody's going to get to use. Additionally, there's this hideable built-in timer that will be appearing right here at the top of your test. You can hide it for some students that have a little bit more anxiety. Maybe they don't want to see the time ticking down all the time. However, I think this is a really, really great tool for the students because there's no more of this scrambling to make sure that your watch doesn't beep, which is the true bane of any test taker's existence, is a beeping watch. And there's no worry about which watches are allowed, which watches aren't allowed. And you can hide it and unhide it as much as you want. Something else that's cool is this thing that it's crash proof. I was extremely skeptical about this existence of a crash proof timer. And I've talked extensively about this with some of our colleagues from the National Test Prep Association who are abroad, and they have assured me that they have heard of no instances where this crash proof timer has not worked. And so what that actually looks like is if there's a problem, your computer dies, there's a fire alarm, whatever, you can close the laptop, the timer will stop there, and you can actually restart again. So that's actually a really big difference to how timing works now. Whereas if something bad happens, everybody's just kind of hosed and has to go home and take the whole test again. Obviously, that wouldn't be an ideal circumstance, but this is a huge, wonderful improvement. So another really awesome thing about this technology is that it does include some pretty extensive annotation tools. And in fact, it includes some annotation tools that you would not have been allowed to use as a non-accommodated student in the past. So what these look like are flat and squiggly underlines. I do emphasize that you can do squigglies as well because it is really helpful actually to have more than one way to annotate. I'm a huge annotation nerd. You can ask any of my colleagues. That's all I ever talk about. And a real winner of these annotation tools was the ability to cross out the answers, and that is undoable. The really big exciting one for me, though, was the fact that you can highlight in multiple colors on this test. So the highlighting accommodation is actually a really challenging one to get right now. And the vast majority of students are not allowed highlighters in the paper exam. So the fact that you can actually highlight in more not only highlight at all, but also highlight in more than one color. This is a huge deal for accommodation nerds and annotation nerds like me. It's very exciting. You can also make as many notes as you'd like. They basically show up like post-it notes all over your exam. So we are losing some things like on a paper exam, obviously you can just sort of write all over it as much as you want, but we are gaining this highlighting tool, which is actually a really powerful and awesome thing. So we're sort of winding up, I think, annotation neutral for this test, which I know is something that I've heard personally from a lot of parents, that there's a lot of concern about the lack of annotation tools on this test. So I just want to assure you that this is something that we have lots of options for, and we'll be exploring further with individual students as needed.
And I bet before tonight, probably most of you had no idea that there was such a thing as a testing accommodations nerd and a testing annotation nerd, but believe it or not, there is. And yeah, we're very lucky to have one on our team. So let's talk about the scoring of the PSAT. So the scoring of the PSAT and the SAT will stay exactly the same as it is in the current paper version of the test. The only confusing thing about this is that the PSAT is different from the SAT. And that was already true for the version of the test from 2016 on. So the SAT, we all know, scored out of 1600 with 2 scores out of 800. The PSAT is scored out of 1520 when it's taken in 10th or 11th grade. For any 8th or 9th grader who ends up taking the PSAT, it's actually out of 1440. I'm going to focus on the 1520 scoring to talk about now because it's what qualifies into national merit. And so it's going to give us a little more insight into how that process works. The paper version of the test used to give you a separate reading subscore and a separate writing subscore. That's no longer the case on the current test. And so for the selection to national merit, here's how it works. It's a little bit complicated, but the overall selection index is what determines if you get the National Merit Scholarship, or rather, if you qualify to apply for the National Merit Scholarship. We'll talk about how that works next. And so you'll get a score out of 228. Basically, you turn your 2-section subscores to a score out of 76 instead of 760. So you're just chopping the zeros off of your reading and writing score and off of your math score. And then your reading and writing score is doubled, and then you add them together. So basically, you're adding your math score with twice your reading and writing score, and then just taking the 0 off at the end. I wrote a formula out here if anyone just like can't follow this and wants to just plug in their scores once they get them. But although on your score report, it will also tell you what your National Merit Selection Index is. So this is how it works. The important thing to note here is that the verbal section of the test is actually double weighted for the purposes of national merit. And so that's the big takeaway. Like, you don't really have to understand how the sausage is made, so to speak, other than knowing that for national merit purposes, the verbal part, reading and writing, is twice as important as math. So how does the qualifying actually work? So there are 2 sort of tiers of recognition for the National Merit Scholarship Corporation. The first is called commended. Commended students, it's basically just a line you can put in the award section of your college application. About the top 3 to 4% of scores nationwide are going to qualify. So it's basically the top 34,000 students who weren't the top 16,000 students. So scores 16,001 through 50,000 in the nation are going to be commended by national merit. you're not eligible to then apply for the National Merit Scholarship. But the semifinalist is what students will really prepare for and what those top students will aim for. That means you're scoring in the roughly the top 1% of your state. And in other words, nationwide, there will be 16,000 students who are National Merit semifinalists, but it breaks down to about top 1% in your state. That means if you're in a less populous state or a state with a worse education system overall, then your score for qualifying for National Merit is going to be a lower mark than it would be for someone from a more populous state or a state with a very competitive education space. So New Jersey is typically the most challenging state in the country, and the score that usually gets you commended as a National Merit semifinalist is about 221 on that selection index. And then for the less competitive states, which are mostly the very sparsely more rural states, very sparsely populated, it's going to be closer to about 212. And the important thing to remember is you don't get the National Merit Scholarship for being a semifinalist. You are eligible to apply for the scholarship if you're a semifinalist. Though there are also individual colleges that have scholarships that only National Merit semifinalists would be eligible to apply to. So if you don't get a scholarship through National Merit, you might still get something through the college you end up attending. So that's an important thing to keep in mind. Okay, now when will we actually find out about these scores, right? This is important for when we start talking about making a testing plan for the spring. So scores are going to be released on 2 different days in 2 batches, and it really depends on when in October you take the test. Students who take the test in early October are going to receive them on November 6th, and in late October are going to receive them on November 16th. College Board has not publicly released exactly what that cutoff date is, so we don't know 15th means November 6th, October 16th means November 16th. It's not that clear. But if you contact your counseling office at school, they should be able to give you information on when your school will get scores back. And then for National Merit semifinalists, they're notified in the fall of senior year. Although if you're curious about your own student and if I think they qualified, you can send me their score and I can give you my opinion based on the data from the past several years, state by state, of what qualified for National Merit in your state for how likely it is. I'm of course not going to know because I won't know how other students did, but by comparing to past years' scores, I can give you a rough idea. The format of this new test. So the test is broken down into 4 sections. Basically, your reading and writing is broken into 2 modules, and your math is broken into 2 modules. And so between those 2 reading and writing modules, you'll get a 10-minute break, after the 2 reading and writing modules, you'll get a 10-minute break where you can use the bathroom and have a snack. Now, one thing that's different about this digital test is that 10-minute break is exactly 10 minutes. It's going to be timed by the app. So currently, when you take a paper SAT or ACT, you're kind of at the proctor's discretion. They say 10-minute break. If everyone's not in their seats until 12 minutes, it's going to be a 12-minute break. But for this new digital version of the test, you need to be back in your seat and ready to start that math section at the 10-minute mark because timer's going to end and then timer's going to start. So make sure you're taking it seriously that this is a 10-minute break. And then, of course, students' favorite thing about this new test is the fact that it's about an hour shorter than the current paper version of the SAT, which is, of course, awesome for all parties involved. Congratulations, students who are taking this. Your friends who are a year older than you we're not so lucky. So this PSAT is adaptive. And so I want to talk about adaptive scoring and kind of what that means. So basically, your performance on the first module of reading and writing is going to determine the difficulty level of your second module, and it's also going to dictate your range of possible score outcomes. So in other words, there are 2 difficulty levels of the second module. This is true for both reading, writing, and math. You need to test into the harder second module to have access to the higher end of the score range. If you test into the easier second module, then you're going to be in a lower score range. Now, the math behind how this test is scored is extremely complicated. It's something called item response theory. If anyone wants to ask questions about that, I probably won't answer them in the webinar because they're not all that relevant to normal people's actual lives. But if you want to call our office and ask questions about it, I love to talk about it. And basically, though, the important thing to note is that your scores, your performance on the questions in the first module is going to be calculated when you click, that you're done with the first module or when time runs out. And then that's how they decide what second module to give you. This is similar to the GRE parents, if any of you had to take the GRE, which is also section adaptive in the same way. Some tests are question adaptive. Question adaptive basically means that you submit your final answer for question number 1, and your performance on question number 1 dictates what they're going to give you for question number 2. You submit that, and it's going to give you question 3. And so it kind of recalibrates your level at every single question. That is not how this test is, and that's to the benefit of students. So the reason for that, thank you, Tori, for that message in the chat. The reason that it's to the benefit of students is that on the GMAT, you can't go back and change an answer. You can't leave a question to come back to. So it happens to everyone, even standardized testing pros like myself and Tori. Sometimes you read a math question and your brain just goes like, and you just don't know what to do. And chances are you just missed some little detail or your wires are crossed in some silly way. We all make silly mistakes, right? So the best thing to do from a standardized test taking standpoint is to skip that question, mark it for later, and come back and answer it later. Usually, if you just look at it with a fresh brain, after doing some other stuff, you come back and look at that, it's just going to click for you, So the current version of the test does allow you to do that, the digital SAT. The version that the GMAT follows does not let you do that. So that's important to keep in mind. One final thing I'll note on this is that a lot of students and parents have asked, okay, so how are you coaching students around strategy for this adaptive version of the test? In other words, if we know that you have to perform better in the first module to get the harder second module, like what can we do from a strategy standpoint to make that happen? The answer is get the questions right, which sounds kind of flippant, and it is. But this adaptive testing is not something that you should really spend a lot of mental energy on. Because if you were to miss 10 questions in the first half of the math on the current SAT, you're already not getting a score in the 700s. So in other words, the current way the SAT is scored already does this. And if you miss enough questions in the first module that you're not getting the harder second module, then you weren't going to score in that higher range anyway. So it's important to note, while we're tracking the frequency of certain questions in the first module versus the second module to figure out kind of what students should be focused on when, there's really not much strategy that a student can employ other than just focusing really hard and trying to get the questions right. That's at the end of the day going to be the best way to raise your score. There are plenty, by the way, of test taking strategies that we can teach you, but things about gaming this adaptive nature are mostly marketing from test prep companies who say they have some secret sauce to always get you the better second module or something like that.
So now that we've kind of talked about the format and like what's really changing in terms of like sort of the technology and everything, we wanted to talk a little bit about the content. So let's start with the content and like what stays the same. So for that, what that really looks like is the answer is most of it. The actual content itself is really not changing very much at all. The concepts, topics, and question types are pretty much all identical. Not quite identical, but nearly identical. And we can talk a little bit more about what's changing in a second, but it is important to note that if you are, for example, prepping for a December test, it's not like all is lost. You will then be able to take that same information forward. So, however, what is changing? So for the math section right now, it's split up into 2 sections. So the no calculator section, which is 20 questions, and then the calculator section, which is 36 questions, 38, whoops. And then right now, that's going away. There's going to be no more no calculator section at all. Also, currently the grid-ins, which are the questions that are the short answer questions, basically the ones that don't have any multiple choice. And they look like this. This is that same type of question that we were looking at earlier. Usually this type of question will be sequestered towards the end of the test. But now it'll be just sort of mixed in willy-nilly with all the rest of them. So if we look here, this one is from section 2, and it's only at question number 3, whereas before it would be perhaps question number like 28 or 29.
All right, so then to talk about the content of the reading and writing sections and what changes there. So there's one big format difference on this new test, and that is that each individual question is going to be accompanied by its own short passage. On the current pencil and paper version of the test that will be in place until December, you get a long passage, and then you answer about 10 questions that go with that passage. But on this version of the test, you're going to get short passage with one question. And those passages on the current version, it's all prose, meaning written out in paragraph form. But on the new version of the test, there will be some poetry, and there will be some question in the format of the bullet pointed notes. So if we go to the next slide, we can see an example of what this actually looks like. So which choice best describes the function of the third sentence in the overall structure of the text? This is a question that you would see on the current version of the test, asking you about the purpose of a specific sentence. But if you look, there's just this one paragraph that you're being asked about. And once you go on to question number 5, that paragraph's gone. And question number 3 had a different paragraph too. So this paragraph is only relevant to this paragraph is only relevant to question 4. And so that's a big difference from a strategy standpoint for students. But I'll note that the skills you're being asked to use, identifying a purpose of a sentence in a passage, that is something that's being tested now. So it's not a content difference, it's a format difference. And there are subtle differences to how students should approach those questions as a result. But overall, if you're working on like the paper version of the test now and you end up taking the digital version later, as Tori mentioned before, most of the stuff here is the same in terms of the underlying skills. There are also logical completion questions. So logical completion questions ask you to logically complete the text by filling in a blank at the very end of a paragraph. So these types of questions are something that we're familiar with as test prep people. We already have it in our curriculum for the GRE because they show up on the GRE. So this isn't a new question type to us, and we're very familiar with how to teach these to students, but they will be new for high school students who are taking the SAT. So that's important to keep in mind. The other thing I want to mention here, and this question I think makes it quite clear, you should always, this is my best test taking tip for reading and writing, so students listen up. You should always read the question before you read the passage. Now, if you look at the way this is laid out, as readers of English, we're trained to go left to right. So that would mean passage first, question second. But here, we want to know what we're reading for when we're reading one of these passages. So if this is a logical completion question, we want to know, okay, we're looking for the logical structure of this paragraph and how that develops and how we would continue it, right? That's a different way we're going to read it than if, like in the previous question we saw, we're just being asked, what is the purpose of this particular sentence in the middle of the paragraph? We're going to pay attention to different things, right? If you read the paragraph first and then the question, you then have to reread the paragraph with an eye for what you're actually looking for. So make sure you go question first, then read your passages for literally 100% of these reading and writing questions. Okay, and then finally, one difference format-wise is that the reading and writing questions are combined. So the paper version of the SAT now, it has a reading section and a writing section. The new version of the test is going to put them in the same section. But they're going to be the questions of a similar type are going to be clumped together. So all these questions I'm about to show you are from the same test. You'll note that this reading comprehension question about the third sentence in the paragraph and its function is question number 4. This question that's asking us about punctuation, which would be an SAT writing question, is sentence number 17. It's in a totally different part of the section, surrounded by other grammar questions. And then 27 here, which is a question asking us about the logic of some bulleted notes, is going to be at the end. And in general, so you're going to see similar question types clumped together as a way to kind of ease the load on students of constantly having to switch from one task to the next. The idea is do some of the same questions in a row, some of the same questions in a row, some of the same questions in a row, rather than just being like, do this, do that, do that, do that, do that. And then you're all over the place. Okay, so we've talked a lot about the digital PSAT and SAT, but I would be remiss if I didn't mention the ACT. And so for students who don't have a plan for exactly what they're going to do with their testing yet, we always recommend students try both the SAT and the ACT to determine which test is better for them. And I'll talk about that in a moment. But just note that the ACT changes more gradually than the SAT does. So if you were to look at ACTs from back when I started in the test prep world in like the mid 2010s, the tests are different now, but they don't completely rewrite the format. I could tell you that, there are certain things that are being tested more often in the math section now, like matrices that didn't show up very commonly at all when I first started this, right? And so we see subtle differences over time, and of course we're tracking them, but the ACT doesn't make these like total, well, we were a paper test that was 3 hours and 15 minutes. Now we're a digital test that's 2 hours and 15 minutes type of changes. The ACT is actually available to take on a computer already if you're part of state and district testing. So ACT allows whole states or whole school districts to pay for their students to take the ACT, often to use it as a sort of progress benchmark for their students. And so students have already been taking a computer-based version of the ACT, and there will be a version available for the general consumer to sign up for a digital ACT if they would like. It's not available yet. They're piloting it for the first time in December. But our advice is to not take the digital ACT if you're given the choice. If you're given a choice, you should choose paper. And there's a simple reason for that. The SAT, when they redesigned the test for the digital format, they redesigned the test to optimize it for a digital format. Meaning they went from long passages where students would have to constantly scroll up and down to try to find their evidence to short passage where if you're looking at it on a Chromebook or a laptop or a tablet, you're going to be able to see your question and see your passage together. So in other words, the ACT is still set up as its old paper format. You're just taking it on a screen instead of taking it on paper. And that has some serious disadvantages in sections like reading and science, where the way they print it on paper, you're always going to have facing pages, evidence and questions, passages and questions always going to be visible at the same time. But the way that the screens display the information is not as convenient for the test taker. So if you have the choice between a digital ACT and a paper ACT in the future, opt for paper. Now, next slide, please. In terms of determining which test to take, I talked about this a little bit on the previous slide, but you want to try to have a benchmark score for both the SAT and the ACT, because some students have a natural strength on one or the other test in terms of the format and what things appear a little more commonly on one or the other. If you take both and you score way better on one than the other, then focus on that test. It's a pretty straightforward thing. For a lot of students, though, their scores are going to be closer, and we're going to take a more nuanced look. What we're going to focus on in giving you a recommendation for SAT or ACT in that case is basically looking at where your opportunities for growth are. In other words, what are your weaknesses? How do we tend to see students improve in those areas? What are your strengths? How do they benefit you on each test? And then, so we're going to look at those things and give a recommendation. And then, of course, your format preference is going to matter too. There are going to be some students that are just way better suited to taking a test on the computer, others who are better suited to the paper format. And so those things are going to come into play as well. In the follow-up from this email, we're going to send basically, we're going to send instructions for how to take a digital PSAT online if you'd like to. And we're going to send an ACT diagnostic test out. And so the idea is, if you're taking the PSAT already in school, you don't need to do a practice PSAT in the digital format. If you'd like to practice for the PSAT, it's there. But for the ACT, we recommend trying to get that done, juniors, before that November 6th or 16th date when you get your PSAT scores back. That way you can make a plan to test in the spring right away. Yeah. So we'll send out the information to that as a follow-up email to this webinar.
So Jim kind of just alluded to it, but there's also a lot of different timelines that everyone's on. And it's a little bit, sometimes a little confusing to decide what your timeline should be for your individual student or for yourself if you are the student. The number one thing that's important about this is have you finished Algebra 2 and Geometry? Algebra 2 and Geometry have been the backbone of both of these exams for the whole time that they've existed, and they will continue to be the backbone of these exams as they go digital. A like kind of interesting little tidbit is the geometry tests. Geometry on the new version of the SAT is a little bit less important than it was before. But that does not mean that you should be just diving in without any geometry knowledge at all. Algebra 2 is certainly the heart and soul of both of these exams, with the geometry more like the liver. You want it, but it's not as necessary. So when we're deciding on our timeline, and you're like, all right, well, I have taken both of these, so how do I decide? So in general, we would say you want to be deciding based on your actual ability to prep. We tend to recommend about 10 to 12 weeks of prep before your first attempt at the exam. And those 10 to 12 weeks should be weeks where you actually can do the homework. And so if you're, for example, maybe your orchestra has like a really intense recital schedule, maybe you're dancing the Nutcracker in December, you need to be really in it on those rehearsals. We don't want you to be prepping at the same time if you have another option. We do have students prepping during their sports seasons, their musicals, etc. every year, and it's always okay. Like we make that work, but we would recommend if you have another option to do it when you're having a slightly lower load. So we like to think of like the sort of the three areas the student exists in is like the extracurricular, the curricular, and then the real life world. And test prep has to be like one of those extracurriculars. So you don't want to be really doubling up on these really intensive scheduled things. Also just your mental health. Some students are just not well suited to prepping during the school year, and that's totally okay, but that doesn't mean that we need to have like a more intense schedule during the summer. So Jim's about to discuss like all the different times when you can take the test, but any of these timelines are equally okay. We just want to make sure that you have a plan, and having that plan is the most important thing.
Right. So there is no one size fits all when you should take the SAT or ACT, but there is a best time for you personally. And so one thing I'll say is that we work with all of our families who, have questions about what that optimal timeline would be to help them figure it out based on extracurriculars, based on starting scores and goals and what we think the length of prep should be. Tori mentioned 10 to 12 weeks. That's kind of a rough average, but there are students who are going to need more or less than that, just depending on what their situation is. So I want to talk about some of these test dates and what we kind of typically recommend. So I'll talk to the younger students first, which is to say my sophomore, freshman, and if we have any middle school families in here, middle schoolers. The kind of ideal timeline, if you're finished with Algebra 2 and Geometry by the end of 10th grade, would be to prep over the summer and aim to take the test early in the fall of junior year, meaning you're taking that September or October ACT, that August or October SAT. And the reason for that is just that in general, for most students, it's going to make sense to try to offload that work of prep into the summer when you don't have to balance it with schools and other extracurriculars at the same time. So it's not to say that that's the best plan for everyone, because there are students who take Algebra 2 and Geometry during junior year. And so for them, we recommend taking your test for the first time in the spring. And so typically you're going to be aiming for your March SAT as your first SAT date, or February or April for your first ACT date. If you are a student who has not been doing test prep yet and you're waiting for the PSAT score to come back to make a plan, and you're going to take that practice ACT like we recommend in the meantime, then we get both of those practice scores in November. Then ideally we'd put you on a timeline for the March SAT or the February ACT at that point. March SAT would mean starting in December. February ACT would mean starting pretty much right when you get that PSAT score back, and we can compare them and decide which test. Now, again, there's going to be a different schedule that works for every student. Juniors, another common thing is trying to avoid the very end of the school year. So the May SAT date is right in the middle of the AP exam window, where you're basically going to have AP exams the following week and sometimes the previous week to the May SAT. So it's not a great time to prep, because you're also possibly preparing for AP exams if you're taking AP courses. And then, of course, the June test dates often overlap with when students are concerned with final exams, final papers, final projects. And so Often we recommend to students in that situation, if they're super busy at the end of the school year, to target the July ACT. You get about a month after school lets out that you can be kind of super rigorous with your test prep and kind of do a 1 month intensive period to try to knock it out on that date. So, the kind of big takeaway here is twofold. One, we want to make sure you have that diagnostic ACT done when you have your PSAT scores back, because we need information about your scores to actually advise you properly on what your testing plan should be. There is more than one way to do it right, but the sooner we have the information we need to make the recommendation, the better the plan is going to be, because we could end up, missing opportunities if we wait until too late in the year to get all this done. Oh, one final thing about test dates is that, and I'm going to mention the kind of test dates that are valid senior year. On any of the programs that I've just outlined, we're planning to be done way before the fall of senior year, but things happen every year that could push a student's timeline back. So most of our students will apply to at least 1 or 2 schools that have an early action or early decision deadline. For those deadlines, the August and October SAT of senior year are accepted, and the September ACT of senior year is accepted. For regular deadlines for colleges, you can take it all the way through December of senior year. So again, the plan is never to need your final possible test date, but I just want to kind of set the table for all the possible options out there just in case. Okay, let's talk about test optional admissions policies. So with test optional admission policies, this is not a new thing. Colleges have been test optional for a long time, but we really saw all of them go test optional during the pandemic. Since then, more schools each year have returned to requiring tests. A few have gone test blind, and when I say a few of the big names, it's really just the California State and University of California systems that are test blind. Test blind means they're not going to look at your scores even if you send them. But more schools every year are requiring tests. So just some examples that are popular with our students: MIT, University of Georgia, the entire Florida state system, UNC, University of Tennessee. There are other colleges that have come out and said we're test preferred, meaning they would prefer that you submit test scores, but they will still evaluate your application if you don't. So all of this is to say that the best way to apply to college is still with a strong score, a score that's going to be an asset on your application. But that doesn't necessarily mean you're sending every score to every college in every situation. If we go to the next slide, there's something out there called submitter advantage. What we have here is a graph of data from the class of 2021 and class of 2022 from those few colleges brave enough to show their admission statistics for the students who don't submit test scores and the students who do. So you can see that just about everywhere, except for Northeastern where it's dead even, submitting test score, students who submit test scores are admitted at a higher rate than those who don't. So just to be clear, yes, it's an option to not submit a test score, but it's a missed opportunity to not submit a test score. If you can get that test score that's going to be an asset on your application, then it can really help you.
So just to discuss a little bit more about like what these scores even mean and how exactly they work, we want to make sure that we have all a common set of vocabulary words. So something that comes up really often is the super scoring ghost in the room. And super scoring is not scary. I think a lot of parents get really nervous about like how to game super scoring and what it all means. So really all it means is that you get to pick your best score from each individual test date. So say you walk in one day and you just knock your math out of the park. You are taking your SAT, you get a 750 on your math, but for some reason your verbal just wasn't there. Maybe you get a 590 and you're not quite as happy about that. You're like, all right, well, I guess actually I'm in a really good spot now because I can just focus only on my weaker section. I'm going to prep 4 more weeks, 5 more weeks, whatever, just really hammering down on our verbal section. And then you take it again, you get that 700, whatever on your verbal, and you're like, all right, now I can be done. This can be done for both the SAT and the ACT. So for ACT, you've actually got a couple more options because they do average the scores rather than add them all together. So say you've got a bunch of a bunch of 30s on several sections, and then maybe you got a 24 just on one section. Well, okay, great. Let's prep just that section. You can walk in, really knock it out of the park and be done. Not every school does accept a super score. But you can always give us a phone call and walk through your college list with us, and we're more than happy to discuss super scoring options, different schools that require all your tests, none like only one of your tests, etc. One thing that is really important for this, in particular, with this big digital switch, is that if you are going to be prepping for a December or November SAT, and then you do wind up needing to take it again in March or later, the College Board is recommending that colleges super score across both versions of the SAT. And the ones that have released their information, I believe all of them have said that they are going to honor that. Since it's such a weird circumstance for these juniors, nobody's really trying to make your life harder. So they are the ones that super score already. Yeah, except Princeton.
Princeton is the only one
make your life harder.
that we've gotten this information from. Princeton is the only one that said no.
Yeah.
You can't super score across the versions.
Yes. So in general, the schools that already super score are going to continue to do that. And this will only be relevant for you unlucky juniors this one year anyway. So everybody else, it should be super scoring as it normally has been if you're taking only digital versions. In terms of preparing for test day, the most important thing is to make sure to create your College Board account in advance so that there aren't any like snafus last minute. Schools should be guiding you through this process, but of course we all know you might be absent that day, something might happen. It's always better to just do it on your own, or at least make sure it's really happened. So students, I'd really recommend setting a calendar alert on your phone or a reminder, whatever you prefer, to remind yourself to have this done at least a week before the test. Parents, if you know your kid is not the best at setting those alerts for themselves, I would also recommend you set that calendar alert for yourself as well. So just make sure that you can bug your kid about it, just so that we can make sure that there's no like last minute annoyances on the day. On actual test day, I really encourage all of my students personally to make a little checklist of things they might need. And usually that checklist just has these 4 things on it. So that is layers of clothing, that is a snack for your 10-minute break. You want to make sure that that snack is something that's nutritious and something that really works for your own personal brain. So I love to game that with students. You can ask me about that on the phone later if you ever want to. That's a water bottle. And that is also, if you do have a love affair, as I do with your TI-84, that is your TI-84 if you choose to continue using it.
All right. So how can we help a student prepare for the PSAT? So if you have a student who feels that they want to prepare for the PSAT, there are basically 2 reasons to do it. The first and most straightforward is national merit qualification. For a student who thinks they might be on the cusp and they want to kind of, do some tutoring sessions to lock it in or be more confident about that, then we're happy to work with them. The second reason would be a student who has a lot of anxiety around tests, because we often find that even just 1 or 2 test prep sessions of, hey, here's the test, it's not that scary. Here are steps to approach the different types of problems you're going to see, run through the kind of basics and the drill in a little more depth than we can in a webinar like this, assuages students' specific anxieties about things. That would be the other reason to possibly consider preparing for the PSAT. In terms of what we do, we tailor our sessions to the specific student. So typically what we do is we assign a practice test to the student or practice material to the student, and we have them complete an assignment, and then we view what they missed from that assignment and use that as a way to identify where they actually need to improve. So what are the question types they're missing? How frequently do those things show up on the test? And then prioritizing the time in session with the student on those particular areas. If you're interested in learning more or preparing with us for the PSAT, I'm going to drop the sign-up link for tutoring. This also goes for SAT or ACT test prep. And I should mention that we also do tutoring for specific school subjects. So I'm going to go ahead and send that to the group. Actually, Tori, would you be able to drop that link? I think because you're the host, I can only message the hosts and panelists. Send it to you.
I will do that. Yes.
Awesome. Okay, so then Now is the point where we'll open it up to Q&A. So we got a couple great questions that came in during the chat. And so the screen share ended up getting wonky. I'm not sure what happened there.
Oh, goodness gracious.
But I'll jump through the specific questions that we got now. So first question. If the adaptive testing puts the student in the less difficult module and it lowers their max score, what does it lower that max score to? So the answer to that depends on their performance in the first module and their performance in the second module. So there isn't really a straightforward answer. I think the highest score that I've seen a student get while testing into the lower second module would be in like the 500s. But that's just what I've seen. Theoretically, a lot of different things could be possible with the other module. So this isn't a very straightforward question because, as I mentioned, the math behind the actual score calculation is very complicated. But think like above 550, below 620 is probably about the neighborhood of where the max would be on a given test. And it can be different test to test as well. Looks like Tori just dropped the sign up link for tutoring in the chat. Tori, annotation question. Can students flag questions, allowing them to return to them if they feel the need to skip a question?
Yes. And it's actually, I would say, easier than it was on the paper tests ultimately, because they are like really obvious when you like go through and look at them. So yes, the answer to that question is not super complicated, and the answer is yes.
Yeah, there's a mark for review function, and it is easier than the paper test because on the paper test you circle it, right? But then you have to flip through every page of your paper test to find your circles at the end. Whereas on the current test, you have a display of all the questions, what's answered, what's unanswered, what's flagged for review. So it's actually easier to return to a question on the new one.
And anybody that's taken the GRE, it's really similar to that. I would actually say that the annotation tools are a little bit better than they are in the GRE, but this particular one looks pretty much identical.
All right. Another question. Would you say always read the answers first, or is that just for passage type questions? So just to be clear, I said always read the question first. So you're always reading the question before you read the passage, and that's true for every question in the reading and writing portion. Reading the answer choices first is a very specific strategy that's not going to be nearly as widely applicable, but you should always read the question before going to the passage. Reading
just to be clear, that is on this new version of the test, not on the old one.
Correct. On the digital test, not the paper test. Another question. How many attempts at the SAT is ideal versus how many would be considered too many? So this is a case-by-case question, but I think the question that people want to ask when they ask this, because we get this in almost every testing-related webinar, is that most of our students will test about 2 or 3 times total. And that's mainly because super scoring is such a common thing that sometimes that third test is necessary to just kind of refine the super score. Now, in terms of how many are too many, it depends on what you mean by that. From the standpoint of colleges, you're going to choose what test dates you share with the college. And that means that from their perspective, they don't know how many times you took the test. The one exception to that that's notable is Georgetown. They ask you to send every single time you've ever taken the test. But by and large, you're going to just share the times that you want the college to see. So from a college's evaluation standpoint, it's not it doesn't matter how many times you took it. But of course, there's the mental health aspect of this as well, and not wanting to put our teenagers sitting through hours-long standardized tests on Saturday mornings when they need to sleep instead and do their other homework. So from that standpoint, that varies student to student. But again, I think 2 or 3 is within the realm of reasonable. Now, there are certain very specific situations when it can make sense for students to test more than that. And usually that comes with a specific number that you're given where if you hit this, good things will happen. There are 2 main scenarios that can happen in. One is athletic recruiting, where a coach can say, listen, I need you to hit X to get through admissions. And if you hit X, you're going to get through admissions. You're going to play softball on that team, football on that team. Great. If you don't, it's a very uncertain thing, and you're not setting your relationship with your coach off on a great foot. The other situation is scholarships. There are certain scholarships that have well-defined numeric criteria for standardized test scores. The University of Alabama has an awesome page on this. If you look up University of Alabama scholarship requirements, they have a separate in-page or in-state page and out-of-state page. As an in-state or out-of-state applicant, you can look up exactly what GPA and exactly what test score gets you exactly what amount of money. Now, it's one of our favorite situations to be in as a test prep company, because we can actually make families money, right? By paying us for our service and us helping you with that score, you're actually going to profit from that as a family and save a lot of money in the long run. So there are schools that have those strict numeric criteria for scholarships. It tends to be more common with the southern state schools than any other type of school, just because they tend to define them a lot more. There are other state schools in the north, for example, University of Pittsburgh, that does something like that, but they don't release exact numerical criteria for it that make it super clear. All right, and then question. So you have to take PSAT in junior year for it to count towards National Merit Scholar. That's true, only junior year counts. Did I hear you correctly that you should also take the SAT junior year? The answer is yes, that students should be, for by and large, aiming to take the SAT officially for the first time during junior year. Many students will retake senior year for various reasons, and that's great too. But you should plan to take at least your first SAT or ACT junior year. Most students that are working with us will be totally finished with the SAT or ACT officially during junior year, and that's always our goal for our students. All right, awesome questions in the Q&A. If you have anything else that came up that's more specific to your student and you didn't want to ask in front of a big crowd or something like that, please feel free to email us at info@myivexperience.com or call our office number. Tori or I will be the one to answer, and we're happy to talk you through any kind of situation, for your own student. We got one more question that came in. Can you use the SAT score for the National Merit Scholarship? So actually you can in a very specific scenario where you can't take the PSAT. So if for some reason your school's not offering it or you have some kind of valid medical excuse to miss the PSAT, there's something called alternate entry for the PSAT. If you email us, I can send you more information about how that works. But if your student as a junior doesn't have the opportunity to take the PSAT, then you can possibly use the alternate entry pathway to take the SAT as your PSAT. The other thing I didn't mention is that to qualify for the National Merit Scholarship, you need what's called a confirming score on the SAT or ACT, meaning you need to submit an official SAT that shows that your PSAT wasn't a fluke. And the idea is just in case you cheated or something like that, you just take the test again under the official conditions. And then, as long as it's close enough to what you got on the PSAT, then it's going to confirm that for the National Merit Scholarship purposes.
Yeah, and you can, for that, use your ACT score as well. So PSAT score or regular ACT score has nothing to do with National Merit in general, except for this confirming score for BIS.
Right. All right. Excellent questions. Thank you all for joining. Like I said, feel free to reach out for anything related to your specific student you didn't want to bring up here. It was a pleasure, and good luck to all you juniors and sophomores and freshmen who may be testing this October. Take care, everybody.